going live and you can mess with it. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for our fourth Ecosocialism 101 workshop. This is part of our ongoing 101 series of workshops. You can learn more about them at 101 greensocialist.net/101s. Like I said, this is Ecosocialism 101. This is a project that we've been doing monthly workshops that repeat quarterly. So we're the Green Socialist Organizing Project. So we have unsurprisingly chosen the repeating 101s to be on the Green Party, Ecosocialism, and organizing. So we go Green Party, Ecosocialism, organizing, Green Party, Ecosocialism, organizing, and work our way through. We've been doing this all of 2022. We will continue doing it in 2023, but we're probably going to switch it up a little. We're talking about that kind of stuff right now. So like I said, thank you again for joining us tonight. You can learn more about the ongoing series, like I said, at greensocialist.net/101s. But tonight is going to be Ecosocialism 101. A quick review of what we're going to talk about tonight. In previous workshops, the first one was kind of like a really big netcast overview, right? The idea of talking about what is ecosocialism, what is socialism, is huge, right? It's a massive amount of things to cover, let alone in one workshop. So the first one was kind of a, everything all at once, right? Trying to get through a whole big thing. And I think we went like 3 hours, right? It was so long. The second one, we narrowed it down and we spent more time in the second one on what is capitalism. And then the third one, which was, when would that have been? August, I think. Our third one in August, we focused in on what is socialism, right? And especially talking about what green socialism, bottom left socialism looks like. So that brings us to this session, right? Session 4. We're going to do a little quick review, try to be done within the first 30 minutes or so of, what is capitalism and what is socialism, just to kind of make sure that we're all, on the same page going forward. And then the focus today is going to be on talking about some ideas, some authors, some works, some, socialist projects, things like that, that we haven't covered, that, that didn't fit into, the formatting of the previous ones and stuff like that. So that's what we're going to do today. I will, preempt it, and there's going to be a slide on it and everything, but I'll preempt it, the whole workshop by saying, like, the amount of works and authors and ideas and thinkers that have, and movements that have been involved in this kind of stuff that we're going to be talking about tonight is massive, right? And we cannot cover them all. So these are just a select few. When selecting kind of the additional things to talk about, I really tried to focus in on, not just fundamental ideas in a broad sense, but really trying to pin down things that I think would be, key for green socialists. So there may be some really key things in, that aren't on here, really important works that you think should be on here, but they may not necessarily be directly applicable to the kind of stuff that we're talking about. Not that they aren't important. It doesn't take it away from it. We're just trying to have a somewhat narrow vision because of the scope and the breadth of what we're kind of talking about. I'll also note this is largely devoid of traditional Marxist texts and also kind of traditional municipalist texts, because we went really heavy on those, in our What is Socialism, because those are kind of key foundational points for green socialist organizing. So we've kind of already covered those in previous ones, and we didn't want to rehash, everyone should read State and Revolution, right? And things like that. We talked about that in a previous one. So I guess before we start, my name is Chris Blankenhorn. I'm the Illinois Green Party Secretary. I'm a former Green Party of the United States co-chair. I served as the social media and tech director for the Hawkins Walker campaign in 2020, and presently I'm one of the organizers with the Green Socialist Organizing Project's Education Working Group. And with me today is Garret, and I'll let Garret introduce himself, and then Garret can launch right into, the thing.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Garret Wasserman, and I'm a current Green Party of the United States Steering Committee co-chair, as well as I've been active in my state and local Green parties here in Pennsylvania, where I've worked on several statewide campaigns and worked on ballot access and all these interesting things. So these live streams are always fun to kind of share experiences and talk about what we've learned and how we can keep building the green movement. So without any further ado, let's jump into our slides here. Today's the Ecosocialism 101, which Chris introduced here. This is the fourth time that we're doing it this year. We've been doing monthly live streams, so this is our fourth case for Ecosocialism. As Chris said, we didn't want to rehash it every single time, so we've had kind of a different theme each time, and this time we wanted to try to expand outside of kind of the typical European mindset, a little bit more outside of the typical like Marxist sort of ideology and all, on other viewpoints of intersectional socialism. So we'll come to that, but first we'll start with kind of a review of that Marxist ideas and stuff real fast. Just in case you didn't see those earlier live streams, those are recorded and you can see them, but we'll go through some of the basic points just to kind of help with what we're talking about tonight. So I like this quote from Gramsci. We have rapid notes that we put forward to stimulate thought and action. Every aspect of the problem deserves a vast and deep treatment. So this is kind of just a reminder that there's only so much we could talk about in a 2-hour live stream. There is so much more to all of this stuff to learn, and not just from reading books, but just learning hands-on, right? Getting involved and active in stuff. So just keep that in mind as we go forward, that there's a lot to all this. And if there's something that stands out to you as particularly interesting, check out one of our previous live streams or send us a message and say that you would like to see more of that in future live streams.
Yeah, I want to reiterate, this is a 101, right? It's not intended to be a very deep dive, though it is relatively deep. And so, yeah, I really like this quote from Gramsci as well. I think it's important to keep us, grounded in the material reality of the scope of what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's to stimulate thought and action, right? To think about where we need to go next to build our movement. So, as long as we're talking about mindsets, the mindset that I also want us to be in when we talk about all this is kind of asking, what do we want out of life? What do we want for our communities? This is kind of a deep question that maybe not enough of us talk about, but I think as part of our socialist organizing process and building community and building community supports, we have to really talk about things like this. Like, what do we actually want out of life? What is the purpose of doing any of this? The capitalist culture that we live in will tell us that, like, well, obviously you want to be famous and you want to be wealthy and you want to have lots of money in this giant mansion and stuff like that, but does not necessarily bring happiness. And, we see that in a lot of media culture, books written through the ages, even up to today's movies and TV shows kind of grapple with this question. Are you really happy with this kind of materialist point of view? Or does the happiness actually come from us being in communities and having friends and family and community supports where we could do fun things together and all? So I think when we talk about this, we can sometimes get a little bit lost in the weeds and kind of forget what's the purpose of doing all this. And so for me at least, I'm approaching it from the point of view of, why do we want to organize for an eco-socialist society? Well, it's because that's a society that makes sure that me, my family, my friends, my community, my neighbors, like everybody around me, we make sure that folks are taken care of. And when we encounter challenges, because life is challenging, there's all kinds of unknowns that come up. And when we encounter those challenges, we should be able to tackle them together. We should be able to handle it together as a community to make sure that we're taking care of each other and that we're all trying to just live the best life that we can. So, let's also kind of think about that as we move forward through all this stuff. How can the theory and the practice of how we organize for socialism get us closer to those sorts of goals, where we have a life that we're really proud of, right? A society that we're proud of and excited about, because we can make sure that everyone is taken care of. And you can work toward your own goals, whatever those are, creative goals and in sort of word, happiness, right? All right, so let's see. I think we actually talked about the outline already, but basically we're going to do a quick review of what's capitalism and what's socialism, very high-level 101 look, and then we'll go through some really fast, some authors that you might be interested in for your personal reading, as well as if you're interested, we could cover it in a future live stream. So those areas include, intersectionality between various, class, race, gender, all of these ideas, but also looking more specifically at the civil rights movement in the U.S., gender and sexuality, independent politics, so like political parties, as well as some contemporary indigenous movements that we're seeing around the world that kind of embody a lot of the socialist ideas we're talking about. Even if they don't necessarily use that language of socialism or Marxism or whatever, they kind of embody a lot of these same ideas and these same concepts, so we can learn from them. All right, so let's start first with what is capitalism, which is essentially asking the question of what sort of society do we live in right now, and what are the problems with it? We kind of all inherently have a feeling of what's wrong, right? And especially when it comes to your basic life necessities, right? We're 3 years into a pandemic, and we don't guarantee healthcare to everybody. There's a lot of problems in the capitalist society. And of course, that grows into much bigger things, which you should check out the recording from a couple months back where we used this live stream to go really more in depth about capitalism. But as just kind of a starting point to think about what is capitalism, we have to kind of get beyond the very basic idea that I think we're all kind of taught, at least indirectly, if not maybe directly, through schools, through movies, culture and things like that, that capitalism is this economic system, right? That like you make a decision that like you have an economic system with capitalism, and it gets associated with some concept of being free, right? If you're capitalist and you have markets, then you're free. Because that was all the Red Scare propaganda against communism, that you had to have markets and capitalism. And it gets really stuck in this economic debate. But really, capitalism has morphed. It has evolved over time to be much more than just an economic system. It's also extends into basically all the spheres of our public life. All the aspects of our society and culture right now, including our political process, are all dominated by this very capitalist point of view. So we have to keep that in mind as we think about stuff, that capitalism is not just an economic system. It's a whole social system. It's a whole cultural system that we're trying to analyze and understand and be able to counter. And it's gonna take more than just changing how our economy works. It's going to take changing how our culture works, where our cultural expectations are of how society should work. So keeping that in mind, we could think about, well, how do we define capitalism? We can kind of understand it's this big system that touches everything, but like we want something a little bit more concrete than that, right? Like how exactly does capitalism influence people's thoughts? Like what sort of way does it make people think of? And there's basically 4 points that are brought up by Peter Staudenmeier in his essay, What is Capitalism? And this is one way to look at it. It's not the only way to look at it, but I think it's a good one. That identifies 4 unique characteristics of capitalism, so that when you're in this capitalist mindset and the way that you think about society and culture, these are kind of underneath that whole thought process. So the first one is commoditization, which is turning everything into commodities. And basically making sure that everything is something that can be packaged up and sold, at a store, at the mall, on the market as a whole general principle. And that we exchange these things on markets. We exchange these commodities to make a profit. That's kind of an underlying assumption of capitalism. I know, I'm upset about it too. So we see the commoditization of not only the economy, but our culture itself, where like our culture, our entertainment, our books, movies, TV shows and all take on this very capitalist idea where instead of them being, for fun and for thinking about stuff, right, and enjoying them with your community. That's not the main reason that movies get made anymore, right? Like, they're made to be commodities so that you go purchase them and somebody makes money. That's the main purpose now. It's not to be, artistic and creative. It's to make money, to sell on the market. And so because the market is so important, the second part of capitalism is that there's an outsized role for markets. So everything becomes emphasized on the market. Everything has to become a market. And we see this in capitalism, not only for, you go to stores for even for your basic needs like food and all, but like the capitalists, which is both Republicans and Democrats in our political system, the capitalist answer to healthcare is, well, you make a healthcare market, you have a health insurance market, and you have movies sold as markets, and they compete with each other in movie theaters, and even our cultural relationships and all start to become this kind of market where we think of the people we work with and even our friends and stuff in this very transactional sort of way that, like, I give you something and you give me something, and everything starts to become this very market-centered thought process. Part of the reason that comes up is because capitalism puts this emphasis on ownership, and in particular this concept of having private property, or maybe it's better to call it private investment property, because some people get kind of confused about what's wrong with having property, what's wrong with having a toothbrush. I'm not talking about your toothbrush, talking about investments. That people capitalism assumes that certain people get to own a thing and keep all the profits from it, even if somebody else did the work or whatever, that there's an owner for that thing and they get to keep all the profits, and they maintain the control over that thing and over the profits. And that's a very deep assumption of the capitalist system, that things should work that way, but they don't necessarily have to. And as we're going to see when we talk about some of the more indigenous efforts and things like that, this idea of private property is not a thing that has existed very long in human history. But it's like key to how capitalism works. If you don't have private property, a lot of the rest of capitalism falls apart. So private property has to not only exist, but it has to be enforced. So you have police and military and stuff that like protect that private property and the so-called right to ownership of it. And then lastly is exploited labor, that to drive all this stuff, the people on top that make the profits, they have to exploit labor. The people that are actually doing the work to make things happen or to create the commodities or whatever, if they were the ones that kept the profits from their work, then the capitalists wouldn't make any money. They have to take that money from the workers. So they exploit the workers. The workers don't get as much as they should, right? Or as much as would actually be fair, because then capitalists wouldn't make money. So you're always going to see exploited labor in one way or another within a capitalist society. You're not going to see labor treated fairly and democratically. And because of the private property thing, capitalists are going to make decisions about what the labor needs to do instead of the workers themselves. And all of this adds up together into what Murray Bookchin identified as the grow or die imperative. That in order for capitalist businesses to keep up with each other in the market and all based on these properties and rules here, they get stuck in a mindset where they have to constantly grow. They constantly have to have new markets to sell things. They have to have new resources to exploit, whether that's people or, some kind of physical resource, whether it's fossil fuels or whatever. But you have to always grow and expand, or otherwise you're done and the market's going to force you out. So all of this stuff together creates what we see in capitalism today, which ends up in a lot of exploitation and poverty. Should go a little bit faster here, but I wanted to make sure we covered some of that. So there's a bunch of myths here, and I highly encourage you to go through this essay by Blair Taylor about 7 left myths about capitalism. It's a really great read. But what's really important to take away here is that a lot of folks who will criticize capitalism or criticize the Democratic Party and all, they have these very incomplete criticisms, because they'll fall back on concepts like, well, people are just being greedy. And that's kind of the whole progressive Democrat sort of idea, right? That you join the Democratic Party because their concept is that, oh, it's greed or corruption or something. And if I replace the greedy people, if I replace the corruption with somebody who's good, then the system is going to work. And that's a fundamentally flawed assumption here, actually, that unfortunately a lot of leftists take, where it's not just replacing individuals that's going to fix it. It's the system itself. Because of those principles, the grow or die imperative and all that we just talked about, the system is self-reinforcing. It's going to, regardless of who the individuals are, it's going to morph its way back into capitalism and to keep that process up, regardless of how good you're trying to be. Obviously, it's worse when you have greed and corruption, but ultimately, it's not going to really significantly change without much more systemic change beyond capitalism. So I don't want to get too much into all that now, but the 7 myths are greed, corruption, that Wall Street or the banks own everything, that big corporations own everything. You'll see conspiracies, and they're on a continuum of how conspiracy they get. And all of these are myths. They're not actually true about how capitalism itself works. So you have to be careful and avoid conspiracy thinking or thinking that only big corporations make all decisions or Wall Street make all decisions or whatever. It's an entire system that is making the decisions, not individuals. And the last 2 points here are kind of criticisms about how we respond to those things. So we have to make sure that how we're responding to those things is essentially the wrong way is to just criticize and pretend that you can make it better instead of analyzing and understanding, educating others, and organizing. So because of these misinterpretations and all, we need a very clear leftist analysis of capitalism. That's going to make all this stuff kind of clear about why we need a socialist response that really changes the whole system away from capitalism. It's not good enough to just be a progressive Democrat in the Democratic Party. You have to be an explicit socialist that's looking to create an eco-socialist society beyond capitalism, beyond the Democratic Party, in order for us to get the change we want. So that's capitalism. So what is socialism? This is a much broader concept, which a lot of the authors we're going to visit will look at different takes on it and different lenses, different ways of looking at it based on your background and all this stuff. So it's kind of a complex definition, but I think a starting point is that socialism is this view of looking at an inclusive, grassroots, participatory, democratic process in all spheres of life. And so just like people tend to think of capitalism as only an economics thing, socialism is also not only an economics thing. It should be beyond economics, beyond the workplace, to be all parts of our life, to be this participatory thing where everyone is included in all decision makings. Yes, decisions about the economy, because obviously that's very important for how we live our day-to-day lives, but any type of community decisions should be this grassroots inclusive process, and that's really what we're talking about when we talk about socialism. So this includes, democracy in the workplace, so that could be like labor unions and stuff, but also community assemblies where neighborhoods and towns and cities get together and make broader decisions, not just about that one workplace, but about like what sort of economy do we need to have here? Do we need to have more agriculture, more industry? Like what are the things we're missing in this community? That kind of general planning should also be done democratically. The management of the commons is one bullet point there. The commons is our common resources, the things that we share, that we all rely on to live. And it's also beyond that. It's also about creating justice. And within the capitalist system, to maintain the private property rights and things like that, we have this very punitive justice system that is not really a justice system. It's really punitive, and it just punishes people for challenging that system, challenging private property and all. So part of our socialist goal is creating a different restorative and transformative justice system that asks, like, how can we help people? How can we restore when something goes wrong, when somebody causes a harm to another, even if it's accidental? How can we fix that? How can we, talk through that and make things better through this community process, this participatory process again, and not just some judge comes and bangs the gavel and says you go to jail. It needs to be this much more humanist participatory process. Eugene Debs, we'll talk about in a little bit, but he was the Socialist Party presidential candidate in the early 1900s, and a great worker, labor leader, union leader, and he describes socialism as a theory of society. Not just that the workers are to own the social means of production. That's part of it, and that's what you hear from kind of that Marxist background. But as is bolded here, socialism also means that poverty such as we now understand it may be abolished. So again, it's this kind of broader concept here that not just democracy in the workplace with unions and things, but that we're trying to abolish poverty itself. We're trying to make sure that everyone is taken care of and everyone can participate in making those decisions to make sure that our society keeps poverty away, right? That we're dealing with challenges as they come up and stuff like that. There's a lot of different views on exactly how to get there, exactly what that means in practice, right? To create that kind of socialist society, and how do we get from capitalism to socialism, right? So there's a lot of different viewpoints on what's the best way to organize and get there. So you'll find a whole bunch of different various schools of socialist thought. And so again, we have a whole live stream recording previously, if you missed it, that really went more into depth into these different aspects. So I encourage you to watch that to learn more about these different tendencies within socialism. But the main takeaway, I think, is to just keep in mind that they're all trying to move toward that goal of creating the grassroots participatory democracy, moving beyond capitalism, moving beyond a couple of rich people control the resources and the profits and make all the decisions, to now the whole community makes the decisions together and makes sure that everyone's taken care of. So you have the early socialists that thought about different ways that you can do that in the workplace. Marxism kind of extended that. We saw a few different variants of Marxism. Anarchism takes a much more critical view of hierarchies in general, not just under capitalism with capitalists making profit. So there's some interesting stuff to learn there. You had the post-Marxists, which we'll talk a little bit about in the rest of this presentation, that kind of extended that Marxist thought into other parts of like analyzing how culture works and all under the capitalist system. And of course, you have the Green Socialists, which is us, right? With this eco-socialist view of how do we integrate a ecological viewpoint into all of this social stuff to make sure that when we're taking care of each other and we're creating this human society, that we're also doing it within ecological bounds, and we're being, we're not, we're not destroying the planet, right? We're not destroying our ecosystems at all. That we're part of those ecosystems, we're part of nature, and we're making a very sustainable type of society that can live with the rest of nature instead of destroying it with pollution and stuff like that. So, lots of different ideas to integrate in. We had a nice little diagram of how all of the different types of socialism kind of sort of relate to each other. And so again, check out the previous live stream recording to get more into that. So before we move into before we move into the discussion of all the different intersectionality and all, we want to first kind of pose this question of, is a socialist society even possible? We've talked about a society that can kind of take care of everyone and allow you to explore your creativity and find happiness ultimately, right? And is that being ridiculous, right? Is that being, too much, too far, and too much expectation? Certainly some people would say that, right? Some people would critique and say you're being absurdly utopian, is one one quote that socialists might recognize. But I think the answer is that it's not only possible, but it is actually sort of human nature. I use that term kind of sparingly because there's a whole lot of background to it. But what I mean is what's on the slide here. For 99% of human history, humans have actually lived in some type of egalitarian and socialist society. Capitalism, especially the the capitalism has infected our culture and all that we know today is extremely new in terms of human history. Capitalism has only been around for a few hundred years, and really the kind of capitalism that we live in today, this global capitalism, is less than 100. It's really post-World War II. So it's important to keep in mind that as much as capitalism in this type of society feels sort of everywhere and it sort of feels inevitable, that's also kind of what billionaires want us to think, right? They want us to feel kind of hopeless, that there's no other alternative. But that's not actually true. There is the alternative socialism, and that is, the history of humanity is some type of socialism. Now, obviously, things have not been perfect through all of history, and there are struggles for social rights and things that we want to continue to progress on. But generally speaking, socialism is a core concept to who humanity is. And you can see this in the writings of, for example, Peter Kropotkin, who wrote Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution. And it's a really great book. Again, this is really not that long ago. When Darwin came up with the theory of evolution from his observation of animals, right-wing folks took that to mean this very like dog eat dog competitive sort of world where nature is evil and cruel and terrible and you just have to fight to survive. And that's not actually what Darwin said, and that's not actually what most analysts have found since then. Biologists, researchers, and all that have looked at evolution. And Kropotkin wrote about this, that actually most of the biological evidence shows that it's not competition, it's actually cooperation that has been one of the key factors in evolution for all life on the planet, but especially for humans. We evolved because of cooperation, because we survived better when we worked together and we helped each other. And that's basically what we're talking about with socialism, that we want to create those communities where we can cooperate and work together for something bigger than any of us can individually do. So I think capitalism is new. It's not inevitable. We can actually change the social structure that exists today to a socialist society, and we know that it can work because that's how humans are. We are cooperative, or at least when given our best potential, right? When we make sure that folks are taken care of, we are very cooperative, creative species. We can overcome many challenges by working together, and that's the future that we're working for. And it's also important to recognize that socialism is not an end goal. There's not like a checklist, and I say, once we check off these 10 things, we have socialism on Thursday. That's not how it works. We also have to think that this is an ongoing process. We're always going to be evolving and dealing with new challenges. And so socialism will evolve with us. But what's important is that we're cooperating and we're working together, and we're always dealing with those challenges as they come up together. And that's that process, not an endpoint. That process is also partly what we mean by socialism. So developing that process requires us learning from both the successes and the failures through history. That as capitalism has progressed through time, various organizations and movements have come up to resist empires and colonialism and all that's associated with capitalism. And they've been to various degrees successful or not. And either way, by studying those movements, we can learn from them, and we can keep growing, and we can keep moving toward that socialist society. So I think that's about it. Do you have any thoughts on all this, Chris, or are you ready to move to the authors?
I have lots of thoughts on it, but I somehow managed to keep myself from jumping in. And
I was trying to go quickly. So I will just take the moment to say I was trying to go very quickly, so I'm sorry if I left things out and all, and I haven't been watching the chat, so I apologize. But we did have recorded live streams on both What is Capitalism and What is Socialism. So if you check those out, those are longer things where we expand on all the slides that you just saw in much more depth. So if any of this was interesting to you, check those out, and you can see much more conversation.
Yeah, so, as Garrett just said, we've done a few different iterations of the same general workshop, right? The first one we did was just like go through everything real quick, right? And we failed on the quick side of things. The next one we dove deeper into what is capitalism, and then the following one we dove deeper into what is socialism. So if you want to go back and see those, it's the February sessions for the broad one, May for what is capitalism, and August sessions for what is socialism. So you can go back and you can find all of those at greensocialist.net/101s underneath the kind of schedule for the upcoming ones. And they're there. The slideshows are there, right? So you can actually look at the slideshows. You can click links and all of that. So that leads us to, the second part of today, which is to try to talk about some, authors and thinkers and movements that didn't fit into that structure, right, of what is capitalism or what is socialism, or even kind of the very narrow perspective we were taking on it, right? Just to kind of expand it, because we knew we'd been largely talking about the same, ideas for 3 months, 3 sessions in a row.
We did a lot of like historical socialism. From like the 1800s and stuff, which is important to learn because there's a lot of lessons from both the movements on the ground, what they learned, as well as a lot of Marxist analysis still applies to today. However, it is still historical, so it's really great to move into sort of contemporary analysis, which is what a lot of these authors are.
Yeah, and it just, it's important to understand, like Garret was talking about the post-Marxists, but they're not really post-Marx, or they're only post-Marxists in that they're post-Marxist life. Right, they are continuing the project of Marxism, which I think is an important thing to understand when we're talking about socialism, especially when Marxism comes up. But socialism broadly, right, is that these ideas were things that were started being discussed hundreds of years ago, that were practiced, as Garret said, for millennia without, expressing it in the way we express it in modern times. But to understand them is not as something that began and ended with Karl Marx, right? People have come in from for decades, a century plus following, and continued to build the tree that is, the Marxist theory today. We're actually not going to go too deep into it. But my one of my favorite examples Garret mentioned was those post-Marxists of Gramsci and Adorno and Horkheimer, and then Guy Debord, who we will have in here today, right? But Marx at the time that we went deeper into this before, but Marx at his time, there was still a clear, not only German culture, but regional German cultures, and there was clear English culture and Italian culture, and the state, right? The nation state was still very much the central thing in the world, and capitalism was up and coming. And in Marx's time, he didn't have I think he kind of saw it on the horizon, but capitalism hadn't merged with globalization and global culture to create, a total global capitalism that we see here today, where it has infected every inch of the globe almost, right? So what that meant was that there's a big part of capitalism that we see today that Marx couldn't cover because it wasn't showing its face yet. And that's where Gramsci comes along, right, in the 1920s. And Gramsci is able to say from prison, right? Most of Gramsci's work are from his prison notebooks, which were, strangely enough, translated to English by Pete Buttigieg's dad. So Mayor Pete fell very far from a very radical leftist tree and his dad. But Gramsci came out, and Gramsci was seeing, the first inklings of a global capitalist culture, of corporations and capital becoming bigger and more important than the state. And he created this idea of hegemony, right? So he expanded upon Marx. And then after World War II, you've got Horkheimer and Adorno who start talking about the culture industry, right? And how even culture is now commodified and capitalized on. Culture in itself is now a sector of the economy, right? Not a representation of a society of it necessarily. And then following up with that, you've got Guy Debord out of France and with the Situationists in the 60s, and his society of the spectacle gets into talking about how, what we even think of as the world we live in is a myth, is a bauble, is a smoke screen, right? And so you see, right, something that was missing in Marx's time, this total cultural absorption by capitalism, was kind of recognized and thought upon in steps as it arose from Gramsci into Adorno and Horkheimer into Debord, and then into modern thinkers that we a couple will talk about. So it's really important to understand that these things didn't start and end with someone, right? It's a long continuing lineage of thought. And before we do dive in, I do want to go right back to that first slide, right, and just reiterate. This is probably the most unprepared I've felt for one of these, and it's because of the massive bounds of work. Like I literally I've been pulling books, and going through my things, and it's like, what makes the cut? What doesn't make the cut? When we've only got this much time, like when I've only got one slide per issue, a lot of these slides you're going to see in this section, we could do many, many hours on each slide, right? So there's a lot of things that are going to be missing, and we may, hopefully in the future, we can dive deeper and do many, many things, do a 2-hour workshop on every single one of these sections and really dive deep. But this is a 101, so, there we are. But to start out, I want to talk about intersectionality, right? The Green Party is an intersectional eco-socialist party. By that, we mean that we understand that identities and experiences interact with one another, and they create different material conditions related to their oppression or privilege, right? Factors such as race, gender, sexuality, disability, class, they interact and they overlap, and they create a wide range of like unique manifestations of oppression and privilege, depending on kind of how they stack up for each of us, right? With that in mind, the Green Socialist, movement should be looking beyond traditional Western socialist texts, right? That kind of historical socialism that we talked about more in our previous workshops. And I linked to the piece by Kimberly Crenshaw, where intersectionality was coined in 1989. And then I've got this, the graphic on the side that kind of gives an understanding of what a visual representation of intersectionality, right? In my case, as a straight white male, right, that came from a largely middle-class background, despite, I'd say, despite the fact that most of my life, I've been working class, and living paycheck to paycheck. My history, my upbringing was very much middle class, and so when I start looking at my intersections, we're often talking about privilege, right? I have privilege from being white. I have privilege from being a male. I have privilege from growing up in a middle class background. I have privilege that I have a degree in political philosophy. Right, even though I used it to become a preschool teacher to make shit money, I still have a privilege to have that degree and have that education. But it works the other way too, right? And the original kind of formulation of the idea of intersectionality came as Kimberly Crenshaw was trying to express the uniqueness of being a Black woman and the dual oppressions that she faced, right? And understanding that, the experiences of what racism is looks different. If you're a Black male versus a Black woman, even, right, within the same race, but then especially if we're talking about what racism looks like and what solutions look like and what, the everyday material problems look like are completely different in terms of racism, depending on whether you are, whether you're a Black American, whether you're Indigenous, whether you're Latinx, right? Whether you're Asian Pacific Islander, that kind of thing, right? They all manifest differently. And then we can throw on like, okay, you're also queer. So now there's a whole new level of oppressions and possible, privileges and things like that can come. And so these things stack, right? And it's not just, it's kind of a rejection of traditional socialist class reductionism, which is the idea that if we deal with capitalism, all these other things will go away, right? The idea that racism is a construct of capitalism that will go away if we end capitalism. But racism has existed since before, bigotry, whatever we want to call it, has existed. Othering has existed since far beyond capitalism, right? And will probably, it's shown that it can adjust and survive through systems. So intersectionality is kind of understanding that these kind of oppressions or privileges stack, and they create very unique things, very unique conditions, and things that will help one person suffering from racism can hurt another person suffering from racism. And so what that generally means is we need to very much cast a larger net. We need to be looking and listening to the experiences of people who are actually under these oppressions, right? This is a very theoretical, right? A theory and analytics, type of workshop that we do here. But the reality is we really need to focus on experiences as much as we do on, academic writings, and more so. We skew way too much into the academic side. But so with that said, moving forward on, with an intersectional mindset, the civil rights movement, right? It's with its connections to broader organizing at the time, and the anti-war movement was, pretty, fully interconnected with the civil rights movement, right? These weren't, while they were their own movements, they were also very much interconnected, very much collaborating, very much cooperating, very much, sharing activist organizers and thinkers. And the same with, the feminist movement, the rising LGBTQIA movement. And they offer the civil rights movement, of the 60s, from the 50s, 70s, casting a broader net, offers a historical moment of upheaval and radicalism that can serve as an example of intersectional left organizing in the U.S., right? Which I think is important. As citizens in the U.S., like as a leftist organizer, it can be very, very demoralizing to kind of think about our conditions and our history, right? Because there's not the history of movements in the United States is getting sucked into the Democratic Party and dying, right? It's getting co-opted, right? And it's getting, sold out. And so it's important to look at this moment in history that, like, when we talked about Marxism, wasn't simply a one-shot that was an end state. It continues today. And we'll talk about some of it there. But, a big one is the Black Panther Party, right? There's a Black Panther Party's 10-point program. When we get to the history section, I've got another, a book about the Black Panther Party in there. Some major thinkers like Stokely Carmichael, Angela Davis, Fred Hampton, right? And in the case of like Fred Hampton, we're talking about a major figure that was active for a very short amount of time, right? I'm not sure from when he stepped onto the scene to when he was murdered, but it was not a long time, right? So he had a huge impact in a short amount of time. Malcolm X, MLK, right? MLK is often very much whitewashed, but there's a very radical MLK that's in there. There's a very radical MLK that was really rising when he was assassinated. I think his legacy would be far different had he lived a few more decades.
Yeah, I threw in the letter from Birmingham jail there as kind of a very a good read if you haven't read it before, because it kind of shows you that radical king that often gets very hidden when today's capitalist society, has Martin Luther King Day and has all the, thank you, Dr. King stuff up and all. They leave out his criticisms of today's system beyond just the racism of capitalism and all. And what you see in that letter is a critique that, as much as he's fighting racism, some of his biggest frustrating moments are dealing with white moderates who say that, we support civil rights and all, but, maybe now's not the time. Maybe we got to wait for this a little bit. Maybe if you try it later, I don't know. You're being a little bit strong right now, And he expressed his frustration with that system, that they're trying to set. I always like the quote of set a timetable for another man's freedom. And that's kind of what the system does, that even when, say, the Democratic Party says they support civil rights, LGBTQ rights or whatever, it's on their timetable. It's on capitalism's timetable. And it's within that very narrow capitalist patriarchal sort of point of view, to where they have to kind of make it acceptable to the ruling class, right? Instead of actually granting the full freedom and liberation, which is what they're actually asking and fighting for. So, not only does Martin Luther King express that in this letter, but his later writings and speeches expressed, how he felt increasingly, because of the moderating influence of the duopoly, that he needed to take a much stronger democratic socialism take in his speeches and all. And I forget exactly which one it was, but I know he started talking more about the need for an independent political party to express those things. And that's really when it shifted to kind of the poverty march, right? The Million Man March and stuff like that. Seeing it intersectionally, right, with class and race and all of these issues coming together. So those are great reads if you haven't seen the Radical King and not just the one that's presented to us.
Yeah, and another great idea that I think is extremely applicable to modern organizing from that letter from Birmingham jail is the idea of a negative peace versus a positive justice, right? Garrett Gray says he thinks you're talking about the three evils of society speech. But back to what I was saying, the King kind of counterbalances these two ideas of a negative peace, right? Where you shut up about being oppressed and we don't have to deal with it, right? Get over it, struggle through it, right? And that how that negative peace really appeals, to liberals and to moderates, who want to look at tokenism, right, and say, well, we've got women as the leaders of all the majority of the weapons dealers, right, of the military industrial complex companies. So that's progress, right? It's just trading. That they're happy to trade a diverse oppressor, right, and call it good and just shut up about the rest because look, they gave you a diverse, so they elevated someone to the top, as opposed to a positive justice, which is what peace, what King and the movement were fighting for, where we get where there's liberation, right? There's actual justice. There's positive engagement with the problems and working towards solutions. So yeah, that's another big one. Kind of trailing on or tagging on to the kind of switch in the later King that Garrett was talking about right there, right? There's a book called This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed. It's there somewhere. No. By Charles Cobb Jr. That takes I think is an important read for Greens and for independent socialists, because it's about how guns and weapons and violence made the civil rights movement possible. Ward Churchill, who is a narcissistic asshole, I've met him. He's not a pleasant person. But he wrote a brilliant essay called Pacifism as Pathology, where he goes into this same kind of idea that without Malcolm, without Fred, King would have been stomped down like previous attempts at liberation, right? Because there were more aggressive elements to the civil rights movement, because it was a multi-pronged movement. King was able to say, deal with me or you get Malcolm, right? Deal with me or you get Fred. So this nonviolent stuff will get you killed, I think, is a really important read for Greens, so that and independent socialists, so we kind of have an understanding of, what nonviolence means and how it differs from pathological pacifism, which is no violence at any time, right? Because that no violence at any time ignores the fact that violence is a natural part of the world, of everyday life. Right, it's not something that I necessarily think will ever just go away, right? And not just talking physical violence, but all kinds of violence, right? So I think it's important. That's an important book that can help us have a larger context of how the dynamics of that movement, of the civil rights movement, worked, right? It's the three main groups we've got here, right? How did the Black Panther Party, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King Jr. all fit into their different slots, right? How did they play different roles? How did they move things in different ways? How did they play each other, off each other positively and negatively, right? As socialists, this is something we should look at, right? Not just the theories, but the interactions, and the intersectionality of it, like we said. I do want to jump back because Emoji said, I appreciate the analytical lens of intersectionalism, but I've also seen simplistic understandings of it leading to people thinking that the replacement of white straight men in organizations is as substantial progress, right? I kind of got into that with talking about tokenism and women CEOs of defense contractors, right? But that is a problem, right? That's come with the rise and popularity of intersectionality, especially among liberals, where they are looking for tokenism, right? They're looking for a liberalized vision of diversity. They aren't looking for empowerment. They aren't looking for liberation, right? I also think a major problem that's come up with the rise of popularity of intersectionality in recent years, a couple decades, is that oftentimes class is forgotten as one of these identities, right? That it's like it focuses really hard into racial or gender or sexuality or ability or education levels or things like that, but class isn't often kept up on that same level, right? It's a rejection of class reductionism, but it's not a rejection of class. It's a very real thing, and I don't think the Kimberly Crenshaw or any of the original users of the term would see it that way, right? And I think that's one thing that has happened, right? Is we've stopped making sure that class is spread throughout our intersectionality, right? In many ways, for most people, looking at this kind of the Venn diagram in the picture, class is kind of a circle that encompasses almost all of them, right? In one way or the other, whether it's a privilege from class, or whether it's an oppression from class, or whether it's a mixed bag from class, right? No matter who you are, no matter what class you represent, it comes into play. So I think that a big part of what Emoji is talking about is one of the big problems is that we've excluded class. And I think a part of that is because it's been adopted as a ideal for promoting tokenism and liberal diversity by liberals who don't want to talk about class. They want to talk about the middle class maybe, but they don't want to talk about capitalist classes. They don't want to get into that deep conversation. It's much easier to it's kind of like what libertarians did to the word libertarian. Mm-hmm. Right? Libertarian was coined by an anti-capitalist, Proudhon, and it was anti-state and anti-capital. And American libertarians have removed the anti-capitalist part, right? And they've only identified with the anti-state. And in many ways, liberal intersectionalists have done the same thing, where they've adopted this idea, which it has value of, the interaction of identity, but they have excised class as one of those identities. And by doing so, they've really undermined the entire system to a point that it's not about liberation and empowerment, which is what we want when we're talking about it. It becomes about tokenism and diversity quotas, which gets into the problem that Emoji brought up. But I did want to jump back and get that.
Yeah, if I could throw in just one kind of comment real fast. Related to the class thing, one of my earliest criticisms that I had when Bernie Sanders started running for president was he talked about a lot of really good issues, for example, healthcare. But every speech he made was about, bringing up the middle class. And that's always been kind of a problem here, that even the most progressive and even the most socialist sounding politicians like Bernie Sanders have kind of ignored this whole class structure. And instead of questioning the class structure itself and the struggle between working class people as a whole versus the capitalists who claim to own everything, here's Bernie propping up that having a middle class, which implies that there's upper and lower and all, right, is okay as long as the middle class gets healthcare and stuff. And that, that's not enough, right? Like when we're talking about liberation for everyone and moving toward an eco-socialist society, we have to address the whole class structure itself, and not just, problems with certain parts of certain classes or whatever. And of course, diving deeper into that, class means, not only socioeconomic things, but, race, gender, and disability and all the stuff we've been talking about play into all of that. So it's a complex problem that gets papered over by this liberal politics.
Yeah, and the Democratic Party is happy to fight, happy to be sequestering, its fight with the Republicans on identity issues, on social issues, right? And avoiding real talks about class and capitalism, right? I'm not one of the people that says there's no difference between the two parties, because on some issues there very much clearly is. But when it comes to capitalism, when it comes to class, when it comes to big picture economics, they're very happy to avoid those things because they're very much on the same page, like Garret was pointing out with the example of Bernie. So the civil rights movement, it seems cliche, right, to make sure that this is centered, but it really was a moment in our history, right? And there were other moments, right? The late 1800s and the early 1900s before the Red Scare, right? With the Haymarket, affair in Chicago, and Emma Goldman and Eugene Debs and all this kind of stuff, right? There were other moments, but this is probably the most recent real intersectional moment that we've had.
And a quick plug here that our previous Green Party 101 streams dive into this a little bit more, but kind of out of the civil rights movement from the 60s through the 60s, 70s, into the 80s is essentially where the Green Party came from, because the civil rights movement and anti-war and all of these groups were largely absorbed into the Democratic Party at this point in time, which meant that all of these issues stopped being addressed. The Democrats, co-opted them and then shut it down. And so there was a real need for a new independent party to represent all of these things. And the anti-war, civil rights, feminism, and environmental movements, and all came together, and that was the birth of the Green Party in the early 1980s.
Gender and sexuality, right? The Combahee River Collective Statement is a really early. Early is probably the wrong term, but it came out of that same time period, right, following the civil rights movement at the tail end, and it was a expression of Black feminism, as opposed to second wave feminism that was popular before this, which was very much pigeonholed into more white feminist issues, and so that there's a, like we said, we'll put all the slide up with links and stuff. But that was kind of one of those foundational moments, right? One of those foundational statements that kind of kicked off the whole new thing, right? So that's a really key thing to learn, read to understand that intersectionality of gender and race. The Tyranny of Structurelessness by Joe Freeman isn't about gender or sexuality. It's about the movement, right? It's about the feminist movement, and it should be required reading for every Green. It's like, to the point that I'm like, every meeting you should read this before you start doing anything else, right? To keep it in your mind, because as she's talking about exactly what we are striving for in the Green Party, which is a bottom-up, non-hierarchical movement and organization. and she's raising, decades ago, the problems that she's running into this within the feminist movement, right? And things like the unspoken rules that come if you don't have rules, right? The de facto leaders that come if you don't have elections, and then the fact that without elections, without processes, you don't have any way to remove a de facto leader, right? It's just such an important thing for us to read, to kind of think about our organizing and whether we are organizing ourselves towards structurelessness and not decentralization. You want to jump in on that one, Garrett? Because I know.
Yeah. This is a very, it comes from a very real concern, right? From these movements that many different movements have encountered it, and the Green Party itself has been kind of grappling with this ever since the beginning. With we're trying to be anti-hierarchical, and so we don't want to be authoritarian. We don't want to push things from the top down. We don't want to force our will on people. We imagine this whole, or not just imagine, we're trying to embody our principles of grassroots democracy and building consensus and just being anti-hierarchical in general. But a problem that surfaces so often is that if you're so worried about being hierarchical that you don't want to set any rules, you don't want to set any structure, because you're afraid that any type of structure is going to be hierarchical. Any type of structure is going to be too top down or something like that. That instead of having a formal structure that supports democracy, you end up with an informal structure that is hierarchical and authoritarian, that makes decisions behind the scenes, informally. The few people that know each other do a phone call, in the back room to solve this, because there's no structure that enables the community to come together and solve it. So it's a very important lesson to learn that, we obviously want to be very anti-hierarchical, but decentralization does not mean disorganization. We have to be, if anything, extra organized with a really well understood structure that anyone can participate in, that we take a lot of effort to make sure everyone can participate and that they have the ability to participate. If there's any structural barriers to prevent them from participating, we fix that, because we have to have that structure to create the type of democratic, participatory, grassroots sort of society that we want. Otherwise, it falls into this informal hierarchy of people that feel like they have to make decisions for others, and then get kind of comfortable being in those positions and saying, well, that's, we've always done it this way. This is how we do it. Even though there's never been a rule. No one's ever agreed to do it that way, except for the couple of informal leaders who decided it. But now they think that's the rule. And we see this in local Green parties, all the way up through the National Green Party. So it's an important thing that we have to make sure that we're conscious of, and building the correct structure that is going to support our vision for democracy.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned it before, right? But we don't just want to read the thinkers, and the thoughts about these different points of intersection, but we also want to read the analysis and the critique of the movements, right, and of the projects and the attempts and the strategies and all that kind of stuff. And that's where the tyranny of structurelessness rises itself to what I would consider a quintessential piece for Greens. There's a great book called Queering Anarchism that's from AK Press, that examines the intersections and interactions and commonalities between radical queer politics and anarchist politics. I read it about a decade ago, and it was a really important book for me when I read it, because it was really, really interesting to see someone taking these two different movements, but showing the ways they work in parallel, showing the ways that they're natural allies, showing how they these two particular movements and trains of thought were able to naturally get along and help each other politically. Bell Hooks, who recently died, but where we stand, class matters, is an essential piece from bell hooks. But really, like, read it all, right? Bell hooks is not Kant. Bell hooks is not Hegel. Bell hooks was not producing 700-page tomes. Bell hooks was a poet, and bell hooks almost always writes in a very short and digestible manner. So read it all, and like we'd said, with the intersectionality thing, like bell hooks gets into feminism, bell hooks gets into class, bell hooks gets into being a person of color, but it gets into all of it. So it's a great piece. Thinking Through Essays on Feminism, Marxism, and Anti-Racism by Hemani Banjeri. Another, it's right there in the title, right? The intersectionality is right there in the title. But centering feminist Marxism and how it interacts with anti-racism. And there have definitely, the movement, there are definitely times that we need to make sure we're doing that kind of centering, right? That we're not getting our blinders up. And not to keep harping on the second wave feminists, right? But after the second wave, this was needed, right? There needed to be thoughts that were, there needed to be authors pushing and movements pushing a diverse feminism, a diverse radical feminism. And then things like Gender Trouble by Judith Butler are just foundational pieces, kind of like the Combahee River statement. I'm going to try to speed up because we've been slow. Independent party politics, right? You always hear us talk about the case for the independent left party, right? Part of that is self-promotion. It's our group ebook, right? It's Howie's ebook. But it's short, it's digestible, it makes a clear case, it shows the history and the functioning of American political parties, and it does so, the whole book in total is 30 pages, and I don't think there's probably a section that's more than 2, right? So it's very easy to digest. Also related to, the Green Party, independent politics, the Green Party strategy debate. It's an older book. It's available on Haymarket, but it's got
essays from a bunch of Greens.
About 24 Greens, right? My light's bad. But it's about 24 Greens. It was all edited together by Howie. And it looks at it. When was it published?
2004. No, 2002. Huh?
2006.
Oh, sorry.
So we're a decade and a half past, right? And it's a good look into the thought process as the Green Party grew. We talked about Eugene Debs, right? Class, another one, right? It wasn't writing tomes, right? Wasn't writing a lot. He wasn't really as much an author, right? He was an activist. He was a speaker. He was an orator, right? He went to prison for speaking, for his Canton speech against World War I, right? And it pisses me off to no end, right? That the left flank of the Democratic Party, DSA, Jacobin, have really grabbed onto Debs and really wanted to portray Bernie as the, Debs' successor. The problem with that is that Bernie broke with Debs on a fundamental issue for Debs, and that was independence, right? Debs honestly, as a socialist, was a relatively conservative socialist, right? Which, he was a socialist, but he wasn't, you're not going to see the same things coming out of him as you would from, Fred Hampton or Malcolm X, right? That we talked about on the previous page. It's a lot tamer. But he was adamant about independent politics. And that came from his experience, working within mainstream politics. So really key there. Callie Akuno's It's Ecosocialism or Death is a great piece. A few years ago, I've given the workshop a few times, but I gave a workshop at the Green Party Annual National Meeting called For an Ecosocialist Green Party, and I had some printouts, of additional readings that people could, take home with them. One of them was Howie's piece for, I believe, Independent Socialist Review that eventually became the case for the Independent Left Party. Another was Kalia Kuno's It's Ecosocialism or Death, which was printed in Jacobin. But Kalia Kuno's another one who's living it, right? He's the person, one of the people behind Cooperation Jackson, big in the municipalist movement, and a supporter of the Howie and Angela's campaign in 2020. So he's another big one. And then I put it first, but I wanted to loop back to it. The Democrat to Critical History by Link Selfa is another one of those key books, right?
Oh yeah.
People we complain a lot about the Democratic Party, but when you read it all laid out, right? Every Green Party local should do a reading group discussion on the Democrat to Critical History. It's a great resource for making the case for independent politics as opposed to an inside strategy. And then kind of tangentially on this, on the abolition of all political parties, and both of these are actually from Germany and the post-war period. On the abolition of all political parties by Simone Weil is a very short book, again 20-30 pages maybe, and it seems odd to include this in a workshop that is advocating for an independent political party, because Weil makes an impassioned case that parties shouldn't exist. I do disagree with her on that point. I think parties are key to longevity and pushing, carrying through gains. But that said, I think her points on what a political party is and what its goals are and how it functions are incredibly important, right? It's important that we read things that are critical of what we're doing. It's important that we read things that provide analysis of what we're doing. And in this case, it's important for us to read something and kind of process the idea that a political party is fundamentally authoritarian, right? Because it's trying to push a platform, right, that has been written by a minority of the population. And it may be a popular platform, right? It may have popular support, but it's not democratic. Even if it's democratic within the party, it's not democratic within broader society. So it's a really important piece. It's short, like I said, it's short, but it gets into the realities of what we're doing when we form a party, and it's always good to keep those kind of things in the back of your mind. And then the other one Garrett added, and that's Petra Kelly and Early Greens on being the anti-party party. Do you want to?
Yeah. Petra Kelly, for folks that don't know, is one of the original founding members of the German Green Party and the European Green Party. And so Petra was and she was a spokesperson for the party essentially for a really long time. And there's a few books. Chris had shown one. She has a number of really great essays on what it means to have a feminist politics, what it means to be a party of peace and nonviolence. A lot of those ideas were actually taking kind of expanding on Martin Luther King's ideas. Actually, they were very well influenced by the civil rights movement. So you could see that influence in how they're trying to expand that into what does it mean to be an independent political party that pushes for civil rights and feminism and peace and all of these ideas. So highly recommend that you read Petra Kelly's essays on green politics. In particular, on this point, Petra Kelly had made a big point about the Green Party being an anti-party party, that we're trying to create this grassroots democracy in which, like Chris is saying, parties are in some sense inherently authoritarian because we're trying to push this platform onto society. And so there was this critique from Petra Kelly and others about we don't really want to push it on society. We want to help liberate society. We want to make sure that people are making their own decisions, and hopefully, they'll come to conclusions similar to ours, and we can cooperate and work together, right? But we're not pushing it on people, so we don't necessarily want to be this political party that's kind of forcing our will on things. And what was interesting about that objection was this came in the early German Green Party, and the German Green Party was actually one of the more successful ones very early on that gained a number of Greens into the German what would you call it? National Parliament. I forget what they call it.
I can't say it.
Bundestag or something. Yeah. So it's something like that. But their national Congress, essentially, right? They got a bunch of Greens elected to that, and on a very initially very radical, eco-socialist sort of platform. There were socialists and communists and all at the founding of the German Green Party. It was a very radical party. But once they got into power, they immediately started making concessions to the capitalist parties because they felt like, well, I have to have something to show the constituents so I can get reelected next time and all. And they started this track toward more, centrist sort of moderate behavior that we see until today. The German Green Party today is much closer to our Democratic Party. They're much closer to sort of a neoliberal party, and they support more of a social democracy, more like you see in Europe, much better than you see in the US, but still they're fundamentally much more capitalist leaning. And that was an early critique by Petra Kelly and the others, that if you hold too much to being this political party that operates within this this electoral system and all, it can kind of backfire and you end up becoming kind of the thing that you're fighting against. So it's very important to keep this in mind, that you're not trying to be a party within this system. You're trying to organize for something new. And in that sense, you're an anti-party party. You're not trying to be the next major party in this system. You're trying to be a party or an organization within a new type of democracy. Maybe you call it multi-party system, whatever it is, but a new type of democracy thing that's more accountable to the people, that's participatory, grassroots, all this stuff. So Petra Kelly's writings and speeches are really good on that.
There's a popular saying by her, and it's not left, not right, but forward.
Yeah.
It's traditionally abused by liberal Greens in the United States, who misrepresent it to be meaning that the Green Party isn't a left party. We're not socialist, right? And so that's how it's presented here, out of context, right? If you read the context, if you read the the words around that saying, what you find is that Kelly was largely saying we're not a campist organization, we're not aligning ourselves with the capitalist class of the West. We're not aligning ourselves with the Soviet top left manifestations of socialist projects, that are kind of the counter at the time that that the German Greens were rising and Petra Kelly was writing, right? We're something else, right? And if you read the context around it, we're bottom left, right? We're grassroots left. We're decentralized left, not authoritarian left. We're direct democracy, not state rule. Not one party state rule. And so, Petra Kelly and her early writings are definitely key. And like we said earlier about Darwin, decades removed and without context, she's very much been weaponized at times as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess we should go on, but I was going to kind of throw in real fast that kind of one takeaway from that Democrats' critical history book for me is that when you see in the entire history of the Democratic Party how many progressive and socialist movements have been co-opted and taken in and destroyed by the Democratic Party. This isn't a recent thing. This is like the Democratic Party was almost in a sense founded to do this, right? So it's really important to keep that in mind, that it's been going on for like 150 years with the Democratic Party. And where we've made progress has always been when there's independent movements. Whether they be, radical unions, the civil rights movement, feminism, environmental struggle, whatever it is. It's always been independent movements that have gotten that ball rolling, not people joining the Democratic Party.
Yeah, it was the civil disobedience at Seabrook from the Clamshell Alliance that Howley founded, co-founded, that ended up stopping, long term, even though they lost some short term battles. Long term, that civil disobedience, that movement is what killed nuclear in the Northeast. It effectively stopped plant production. Like I said, they lost some fights too, right along the way, but in the end, the mainstream politics and the economics, because nuclear has never been very economical, but the mainstream politics had to bend to the movement, and had the movement been co-opted, I don't think we would have seen that need to actually give that level of accommodation. So it's a good transition from Petra Kelly and her commentary to contemporary socialist projects. Whether we agree with their models or not, a lot can be learned from socialist projects of the past and present. Notice on here the large socialist projects, Soviet Union, China, aren't listed because we got more into them deeper into in our discussion of Marxism and on the previous ones, right? So I didn't want to take up space on a single slide for things that we had gone deeper in than we would tonight on another one, right? But the first Ecosocialist International Plan was largely written by indigenous folks from the global South, right? Oops. It provides a strategy and a plan for action. Was published in 2017, and it's a good model of an eco-socialist future that isn't guided by the West, right? And we can see what happens when the West guides by looking at like the COP negotiations, right? Where the U.S. is the one that's killing any kind of real teeth to enforcement and anything like that. The ELZN, the Zapatistas, right? There's a link there for the principles of the Zapatista movement. Chairman Marco did a really good piece that was 10 years. Yeah, Yabasta, 10 years of the Zapatista uprising, Subcomandante Marcos. I've got a really good long book with the history that I can't remember who it's by to look for, to grab. But right, and the Zapatistas are, a great model for bottom up, organizing and bottom up socialism, indigenous led socialism, right? They are a great model for art and beauty in revolution. I actually, when I was a senior in high school, I was taking a political science class, and our final paper was to write a research paper on a terrorist organization, and this was in the early 2000s, and the Zapatistas were on the list. And so I went to my teacher and I said, I'm going to do the Zapatistas, but I'm going to write a paper about why they shouldn't be on this list. And I did, and she removed them for future years from the list because I was able to make a compelling case that they weren't a terrorist organization as the West and as the Mexican government wanted them branded, but they were a revolutionary organization. They were a liberation movement. They took over a whole region of Mexico that was indigenously populated and was traditionally oppressed and forgotten about, right? They didn't have access to services. They didn't have access to things. And they took it over with mostly fake guns, right? They took it over and they read poetry from the balconies, right? And while they were reading the poetry, they also established medical systems that exist today, right? They achieved a level of autonomy that allows us to look to them, right, and to see what on a small scale can be done. That said, it's a single region of Mexico, right? So there's some shortcomings in its, um, applying its lessons to a broad movement in the United States or globally, right? But there's a lot of really valuable lessons that can be learned. And a lot of, I think when we see places get this kind of autonomy and get the opportunity to try out, tactics, strategies, policies, it's important that we look to them. And the Zapatistas have long been an inspiration for the bottom left, and so that it's not surprising that they would be on this list. A similar kind of.
Before you move on, I wanted to kind of note about those principles that kind of in keeping with what we've been talking about. It's a really short document that has just kind of an outline. It's like 2 pages. But the principles that the Zapatistas try to follow are very good. They're very non-hierarchical, and they put a huge emphasis on communities coming together to discuss, to deliberate, to doing education to make sure everyone is in the loop, and to making sure that information is available to everyone, that all decisions and processes are very transparent and available to everyone, and that it's not pushed by anyone, right? It's not pushed from top down, that every decision is made from the community levels bottom up, and that when they weren't sure about things, they would send representatives to communities to talk to people there directly and ask them about their thoughts and make sure that all of that was included in the decision-making process. And all of that, I think, are really great principles for us to take to heart in the U.S., that a lot of our organizing, which next month, Organizing 101, a lot of our organizing should really be along those similar lines, that we need to do deep canvassing type stuff where we're going to our communities and doing very similar things. We're talking to people directly about, what do you need? What are the problems you're facing? How can we work together to fix that? So definitely read up about Zapatistas there.
Well, and I wasn't going to read them, but since you mentioned it, I will, because they are awesome, right? Number 1, lead by obeying. True leaders follow the will of the people, the desires of the larger community. Number 2, propose, don't impose. Make proposals for community feedback rather than imposing rules without community input. Number 3, represent, don't replace. Always represent the needs and views of the community at the table rather than standing as an individual in place of the community. Number 4, anti-power against power. Demonstrate alternative power that challenges traditional forms of power. Number 5, convince, don't defeat. Build power by convincing people towards just decisions rather than repressing people who disagree. Number 6, everything for everyone, nothing for ourselves. Leaders are not in power to benefit themselves personally, but to fight for the benefits of everyone in the community. Number 7, construct, don't destroy. Exercise power to build a new world rather than focusing all energy on destruction or opposition. And number 8, we want a world where many worlds fit. Strong communities embrace diversity, and that is rather than needing to suppress those who don't fit into the norm, right? Like, those are all very much on point, right?
Those are basically our 10 key values.
Yeah, right. Those are like an organizing key values, right? And every single, and the bit I read was their heading and their principle, but then each one of them has a practice section too that talks about how they do it. So like a very, 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 very good model to think, to keep in our mind, and to avoid. We have to remember, right, that this is a minority group that's taking power, and they know what it's like to have been the repressed minority, and so they're really trying not to replicate that. Right, they're really trying to create a different type of world. And like, why do I bring up things like reading poetry from the city hall balconies after they stormed City Hall? It goes into that idea that I think too many socialists forget, and that's we need to be creating, right, and looking creatively and future focus and building as much as we need to be thinking about tearing down capitalism. If we tear down capitalism and we don't have a blueprint for what we want to create, if we're not creating, I think the idea that capitalism falls in one swift blow is pretty naive in and of itself. So as we bring down systems, right, we need to be creating their alternatives, or else we leave an opening for the capitalists to come back. Because if we take out the private health insurance companies, but we don't instill national health service and universal health care, now it just means that no one has any help affording their health care. Right? We've got to put the replacement in place as well. We've got to create while we destroy. So I wasn't planning on it, but since Garret mentioned it, I think they are just on point organizing principles. Pivoting from there to a very kind of similar regional autonomy in Rojava, in Syria. We've got a couple pieces here. One is make Rojava green again. The other is building democracy without a state, that one looks at the Rojavan democratic confederalism, right? The bottom up democracy that they are trying to build. I do think that this is a very interesting case in that we have a leftist movement that's receiving support from the United States government, that's receiving arms from the United States government, right? Traditionally, the United States government, like we go down to the Latin American projects, Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, we've tried to coup every one of them multiple times, right? We're constantly meddling in their politics. We're constantly trying to kill their projects. But in Rojava, within the Kurdish independent zones, we're actually supporting them. And it's another, minority population that's kind of gotten autonomy and is trying to build something different. And so it's another good model for us to look at and to see how things play out, right? And some of the things I was asked about in a discussion of Medicare for All recently that Garret probably saw, but I was asked about, places like the Zapatistas and Rojava, right? And how were they providing healthcare? And in both those cases, they are trying to start their own, healthcare systems. In the case of the Zapatistas, because it's very indigenous, they have local clinics that are very tied into traditional medicine, right? And then the larger cities in the region have, more modern medical clinics that work and tie into very holistically with those small, indigenous, traditional clinics. And then because Mexico has a national health, system, if their local can't provide, then there is a fallback, right? And Rojava has the same thing with Syria. There are still private hospitals. There is still a state system where if you need something that the small autonomous community can't provide, there's a safety net there, right? So these projects are in a way getting to do an experiment with a safety net in place, which is nice.
What I think is really cool, especially about Rojava, is that, again, if you look at our previous live streams, Green Party and Ecosocialism, one inspiration for some of the early Greens was Murray Bookchin, and some Greens like Howie Hawkins worked with Bookchin to form the early Green Party and the left Greens and all. And Bookchin's ideas were a very bottom-up municipalist sort of approach to building an eco-socialist type of society. And Bookchin's writings inspired some of the folks in Rojava. And so there's kind of this direct connection between Bookchin and Green politics to the style of government, for lack of a better term, that Rojava has developed, where they were influenced by Bookchin and Green Socialist politics of building up from this kind of municipal bases that really emphasize, grassroots democracy and participation and building confederations of these municipalities that work together to provide that safety net, like Chris was talking about. And you're supposed to look at that lens of Green Socialism through, whatever your unique challenges are in your particular region or culture or whatever. And so it was adapted into something that was based in kind of Syrian culture, a Kurdish culture that kind of tried to compensate with things that they've been struggling with for a long time. That, for example, some parts of that region, just like we have in the U.S. and all, have this kind of very patriarchal sort of history. And so in order to try to address that, they've integrated into their system kind of checks and balances, where there's, for example, a women's assembly that can veto things if they feel like the men in the General Assembly are trying to push things on women. So they're doing this experiment on how to do much more direct democracy and having these delegates that go to these confederal meetings. That are split up in ways that can try to kind of counterbalance each other and make sure that minorities are heard. Any issues, any concerns, right, are heard and built into the process and not left out of the process. So it's very fascinating to see this real time in general, because they're building this sort of socialist sort of society. But I think it's especially interesting for us Greens because this is one of the places we can point at and say, like, this is directly influenced by green politics, and where this goes and what we can learn from it is very fascinating.
And then, to pivot again to kind of manifestations of this within the United States, right? Of municipalism, right? This idea that most of the power should be bottom up, should be based in our local communities, which is a complete inversion of what we have within our modern, in the U.S. especially, system with the federal government. I know the Republicans like to talk about states' rights, but state or federal, it's a top-down system, right? Whereas municipalism seeks to have a bottom-up system. One of the best ways I've kind of heard this expressed was actually in regards to Howie's 2020 healthcare plan, which was written in cooperation with Dr. Margaret Flowers, right? And the idea of a community-controlled national health service. In our present system, right, if you've got a top down, a number of X amount is determined to fund the medical system, right, bottom down or below. And so it gets divvied up, and schools are another great example of this, right? There's a budget given and you get what you get and you have to make it work, right? It's a top down funding model. Whereas in a community-controlled system, regional health boards, regional school boards would come up with the budget for what they needed, not with what they could make work, but with what they needed, and they set that upward. And then things like tax rates were set in order to actually give them what they needed to succeed. And when you do it bottom up, it's a lot harder to have that kind of make do, right, type of policy. So here in the U.S., Cooperation Jackson is probably the most well-known municipalist organization. They exist all over the country. There's whole solidarity economy organizations and municipalist organizations and all that kind of stuff, right? But it's kind of like a parallel power, right? Where they're trying to do economic development and sustainable development to get community ownership in play. And kind of flip how we do economic development, which is business first in the U.S. right now. So there are local manifestation of that. Then that we had the Ecosocialism or Death article from Kali Akuno earlier, and he's one of their leaders in Jackson. I'm sure they're very busy with the water crisis. Which, like, when a water crisis happens, that's when Cooperation Jackson isn't the government. Cooperation Jackson is the mutual aid, right? Is a way to think of it. And I think it's a good way to kind of process through how they fit.
Yeah, but it can eventually become the government if the government refuses to do anything and people align more with Cooperation Jackson. I think that's kind of the goal of any municipal movement, that you build these mutual aid networks that do a better job than government. And so people are like, why should I even pay attention to government anymore? Like, I have this thing I can participate in that's doing so much better.
And I think one of the reasons why, probably the main reason why Cooperation Jackson is the best known in the country, is because they are the ones who've been the most successful at that, right? They've got the deals with the government. They've moved the government on things, right? An example I often talk about from Illinois is an organization called Carbondale Spring. They're based out of Southern Illinois in a college town, but one of the reasons I almost I bring them up usually is when they formed, they spent a year doing research. They didn't go out and organize. They didn't go out and have meetings and try to grow. They learned about their community. They did research on the city budget. They did research on the county budget. They did, deep dive research on the university, which was the cornerstone of the community, but is failing, right? And they bided their time, right? And so the first thing they came out with, one of their big issues was green energy and solar, getting solar installed and things like that. And so a organization or a company was going to come and build a solar plant, except they were going to put it in the middle of a working class community that didn't want it. They were going to push people out of affordable housing to build it, right? It was a development driven, not community driven, not need driven. It was development driven. And so the first action they actually took was killing a solar plant, despite the fact that one of their 4 pillars was, green energy. But it built this relationship with the community where they saw that they not only did they show up, but they essentially shot themselves in the foot because they heard the community's voice, and they'd rather, like the Zapatistas said, right, rather than pushing something on them, which they thought was good, which was green energy, they listened to the community and they said, we need green energy, but not here, right? And so then that gave them a little bit of a start. And then the local city council was debating a welcoming city referendum because Trump was coming to town to speak. And so they wanted their city council to say, we don't want Trump here. Sure, he's been invited. We can't stop him because he's speaking, private event, but we will put out a statement saying we don't welcome him or his, views here. Well, the city council waffled and tabled it, and they refused to act. So Carbondale Spring and members of the community went outside, declared the city council to have abdicated their duties as city leaders, and passed said proposal. Now, did the proposal actually pass and is on the books? No, it was completely a PR stunt, right? It was completely, but the newspaper covered it probably more than they would have covered the city council passing it, right? And a clear statement was made, and they've all of a sudden, and they've risen to a point where they've declared the city council to have abdicated their duties and that they're now in control. And they weren't in control, but it gave them this level of leverage and this level of visibility that all of a sudden they had the spotlight on them, and they were able to drop, like, here's our 4-point plan that we want to do. And when I'd spoken to them last a couple of years ago before the pandemic, the city was giving them acres upon acres of land and parks. The city to build permaculture gardens and farms. The city was paying for a farmer who would farm those farms and would train community organizers and community volunteers to run them so that the farmer could then go start another farm, right? They had tens of thousands of dollars from private and city funds put into a slush fund that was made so when a business was going out, they would help the workers buy it, right? To support worker ownership. They put the police budget on the table in a very real way, right? They had agreements from local solar companies that they were charging premiums to people who could afford it so that they could get lower prices for working class people to get solar, right? So they were able to form this alternative power that was able to move the city government, right? And it's always like with everything, it's an ebb and flow. But because they were ready, because they were prepared, because they were focused on these things, and because they built up those real life relationships, when all of a sudden the bucket was ready to be kicked over, they were able to do it, and they were able to get some really big things, right? So it's important. The problems we face, y'all, they're huge, they're total, they're global, right? And so often it's overwhelming. And municipalism, like whether you agree with it or not, does offer a rosier view that we can actually affect change, right? It's much easier, I think, to get your local city council to push green energy as opposed to relying on the leaders at the COP27, right?
Well, I think one lesson to take from municipalism is that whether you think it's enough or not, if you think maybe there needs to be some larger organization or whatever, you're still going to have to organize at community levels anyway. So this is absolutely where you start, and then where we go from there is up for discussion, and we need to try things and see what works. But like, we can really learn a lot from these movements.
And even if the Green Party is the prime example, even if you've already got that larger organization, right, the key to its health, the key to its growth, the key to its success is organizing at the local level, right? That larger organization's there to coordinate and help out and provide assistance and add efficiency, but the lifeblood of the organization is on the local level. Next up, Modibo Kadali on Pan-African social ecology, right? So very much like we talked about the first Eco-Socialist International plan, right? Here's a Pan-African version, vision of an ecological future, right? So these aren't ideas. These aren't ideas that we in the West have, any kind of exclusive right to. It's in fact the opposite, right? We live in the belly of the beast. We need to be listening to the experiences of those people suffering from our actions. We need to be looking to the global South, looking at the first Eco-Socialist International plan, looking at the Pan-African Social Ecology Plan, right? And accommodating them and bringing them into, looking at the Red New Deal, right, out of the United States, which is an indigenous-led vision of, an ecological future. We shouldn't see these things as competing ideas to what we're talking about. We should be seeing them as, inspiration and things that we should be looking and taking really deep thought into as we here, like I said, in the belly of the beast, right? In one of the major polluting states. We need to be thinking about the downstream effects and, what our priorities are. Because our priorities should sync up with the priorities of the global South. They should, sync up with the people out that are suffering from our, opulence.
Yeah. What I'd add in there is that, we're kind of running out of time, but essentially, I think Kadali hits on this idea, very similar to the Zapatistas in Mexico and the Kurds in Rojava. There's a very rich tradition and history of kind of grassroots democracy and communities coming together and making decisions together in Africa. That is the tradition in a lot of places. So, Kadali's talking about kind of going back to those roots and growing this indigenous movement of based on those traditional African principles, but also looking at ecology and building a better world, beyond capitalism, where we fit in with nature and all. So it's really important.
As a Marxist too, like, it's really important that we let local culture, local, conditions drive things, right? That they are centered, that it's not, kind of like the Zapatista principles that said that we're not trying to standardize, right? There is no standard solution. So it's really important that we're looking at these local manifestations of allied ideas and giving them weight and power. Another thing I'll say too, since we're talking Pan-Africa, they're not in here mainly because they tended towards the more traditional Marxist-Leninist projects that we've talked about in the past, right? In other ones, but Africa has had its fair share of liberation art, liberatory revolutionary movements, that we can learn from. Gaddafi is probably a key one to look at when you read the Little Green Book. It's something, whether it was played out or not, as written, is a whole other discussion. But it's a vision that is very much in line with what we're talking about, right? With a socialist view, and then Mbaba and Frantz Fanon, and there's numerous, Mandela, and there's numerous other examples, and in this case we chose the social ecology, but there's a long history of revolutionary and liberatory movements we can learn from in Africa. And then now, a lot of the major socialist projects we talked about are Latin American ones, right? Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia. There are just, victories in Chile. And so Lula, or has Brazil gone to its? Lula won, right? They did their follow up.
Yeah, he did win. I'm not sure when they take off.
Sorry, elections are just a blur in my head right now,
Yeah.
right? But we're seeing a left movement again in the Latin American countries, and we can and we're seeing the evolution of these projects, right? The Cuban in Cuba, they just passed a whole new section of laws on families that constitutionally protect gay rights and gay marriage and things like that, right? A few years ago, not few, but probably closer to 10 at this point, we saw a large part of the old guard in Cuba step down from their longtime leadership positions and say it's time to pass it on to another generation and see how that goes, right? So there's a lot, these are actual attempts and projects, right? And we can learn, man, from one of the things we can probably learn the most from the Latin American examples is how the capital will respond, right? We seize about a quarter of Venezuela's GDP every year, right? We seize $1 billion a year from Citgo, which is the Venezuelan, which is their oil company, right? So we can learn a lot from what we're going to have to deal with, right? One of my favorite examples is in Venezuela is that they know we're going to accuse their election of being illegitimate. So they have created, in my opinion, the model of a modern election system. Now, a voting system can't get around corruption or, political party repression or things like that are, could be real criticisms that someone could have. But when it comes to actually casting in your vote in Venezuela, it's almost fraud proof. The results are almost immediate. They publicly audit 51% of the voting machines. Every party involved has to sign off, right? Guaido, who cried foul, and the U.S. tried to appoint him president, they didn't even run, right? Because they know that they can't say that it was an illegitimate election, because they know that we're going to say that. So they created a model of a modern system, right? So we can have our criticisms of these countries, right? We can have criticisms of Venezuela being a petrostate, right? We can have criticisms, especially in some of Cuba's past, right? But as socialists, we also need to have critical support. We need to support them against the attacks from the West and the attacks from capitalists, and we need to look at them and see where they succeeded, right? People say a lot of things about Venezuela, but they build more public housing than the United States does, with a fraction of the GDP and a fraction of the population, right? They've massively reduced poverty, right? Massively reduced illiteracy, right? So, and we also have to keep in mind when we're talking about all of these countries in the global South, in South and Central America, and Africa and Asia, we're talking about post-colonialism too, right? They're still dealing with colonial ties. They're still dealing with bad deals from previous governments. Like Venezuela ships their oil to the United States to be processed. They don't have their own processing facilities because that was the deal that was made under pre-Bolivarian governments, so pre-Chavista governments. So we need to look at these and see what they're doing and see what's good, what's bad, but they offer a model. Some quick theory, right? And this is one of the ones that's like, there's so much. But I was trying to, identify some things that were very applicable, in my opinion, to green socialist organizing. Pedagogy of the Oppressed, like I said earlier, Joe Freeman, is a must read. Pedagogy of the Oppressed is a top 5 read for me and for every socialist. It really gives a great foundation to think about, how does power work? How does oppression work? How do we build an actual alternative to this? And, Yeah, it's largely framed within the context of education, but its application is pretty boundless. It's not given anywhere near it shouldn't be considered a niche education theory book. It should be considered an organizing manual and a leftist, centerpiece. We talked about African liberation movements. Frantz Fanon, Voices of Liberation is like you know, Wretched of the Earth is a popular Fanon, right? That's more theory. Voices of Liberation is like a recollection of his life, right? It's interviews, it's articles, it's it gives a good view of the life and the movement and the thoughts of a revolutionary African socialist. Ecosocialism by Michael Lowy is one of the main books that I'll often see on ecosocialism, and it's small, right? I think my copy's actually downstairs, but it's another one of those 100-pagers, not very big. We talked about Bookchin, right? There's so much Bookchin that's applicable to our movement.
Yeah. That one particular is focused on municipalist ideas that we have covered already, and a lot of that fed into the early Green Party's key values and stuff too. So it's Bookchin wrote a lot, but that's probably a great starting place.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, or like the principles of social ecology are another key one, right? So Bookchin's one of those people. There's a bunch to read. Michel Foucault, Power, Sexuality, Gender is not the name of the book. It's kind of issues that he delves into. His book Discipline Power is great, right? When I was a community organizer, I was knocking doors in a working class mixed race neighborhood in my town, and I knocked on a door, and a young 20-something black man answered the door, and I was supposed to have a conversation like 2 to 5 minutes, and I talked to him for an hour. But I was the boss, so I was okay to do that. My job was actually the people that in 2 to 5 minutes warranted an hour, I would come. But I happened to get him, and we spent an hour talking about power, right? And this young man articulated ideas about power and where it resides in ways that would make you think that he was well read on Michel Foucault. But he doesn't, he's just talking from experience, right? Living as a working class black man, right? In one of the most segregated cities in the country. And on top of his card that we filled out, I actually wrote Foucault and doesn't know it, right? Foucault's work on, oh my God, I can't think of it, on prisons. I can't think of the word, but basically on self-policing is really, really powerful. And then he was an early influential person on sexuality and gender. I talked about Guy Debord earlier, right? When in our kind of post-Marxist ramp up from Gramsci to Horkheimer to Guy Debord. Guy Debord was a situationist. He was part of the situationist movement. The situationists believe that, like, rather than engaging in an ongoing revolution, right, that you wait, kind of like Carbondale Spring did, right, in the story I told earlier, that you wait and that capitalism will provide moments of weakness when you can give a good kick. And so the situationists were one of the main kind of thinkers behind the May-June 1968 riots in Paris. One of these things that, like, it seemed like it just popped off out of nowhere and then it disappeared. And the situationists like Guy Debord at the time were, said, well, a weakness was shown, a crack in the glass was shown, and we had to hit it. And, they shut down Paris for 2 months, basically. But his Society of the Spectacle it's written really interesting way, really digestible and short, but it gets into like the idea that when you ask someone what capitalism is, they give you a myth, they tell you a story, and it's not based in reality, right? That with the world we live in and the world we perceive are different things, and we need to grapple with that. Kind of on a similar thing, Abby Hoffman's Revolution for the Hell of It. I think Greens and independent socialists have a lot to learn from the Yippies and their theatrics and their ability to see that point, kind of like the situationists, right? To see that point of weakness and to hit it. My favorite Yippee story is when they were going to levitate the Pentagon. They went to the Pentagon and they were holding hands, and they'd like walk from one end to the other. And obviously, military police came out and they said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "We're seeing how many hippies it takes to encircle the Pentagon, holding hands." And they were like, "Okay, we'll come inside and talk to us." So then they laid out this whole plan that they were going to encircle the Pentagon, and they were going to have, people from, religious leaders from all different religions there, and they were going to levitate the Pentagon into the air, and they were going to excise the demons from it. And the Pentagon gave them a permit to do so that stipulated that the Pentagon would rise no more than 1 foot off of the ground. Like, you're doing something right if the government makes that joke, right? And then the picture of the girl putting the flower in that's from the levitation of the Pentagon, right? So they had a swagger and an attitude within the movement, within the anti-war movement, within the civil rights movement, that I think we have a lot to learn from, right? I think we could, we always talk about how do we get people to pay attention. The Yippies knew how to get people to pay attention. And they also had great politics, right? When Occupy started, I was part of a group called the Radical Student Union, and we showed up at a meeting, and we started handing out buttons, and they had a red star, and they said leader, and everyone said, and we got this idea from Abby Hoffman and the Yippies. They did this during the anti-war movement, and people we'd give them to people, and they would say, I don't, Occupy was real big on we don't have leaders. And they said, I'm not the leader. We don't have leaders. And we'd explain to them, we're all leaders. And if we're all wearing the buttons, we're all leaders, right? And it was a way to start that conversation. So they were really good at that kind of, for lack of a better word, PR organizing that we can learn from. Sun Tzu and the Art of War, like, seriously, y'all, if you haven't read this and aren't applying it to your politics, I don't know what you're doing. And actually, I know that a lot of people haven't, and a lot of people aren't, right? Because there are times when I'm like, have you never read this? Like, do you have no idea that you shouldn't go into a battle that you're going to lose, right? Or the idea of, going into a struggle and making sure that the conditions are right for you, doing everything you can to have the right conditions for victory. Yes, it's about war, but it can be very much applied to politics. And it's simple, and it's thousands of years old, and it's still very, very much relevant. 1,000 Plateaus by Deleuze and Guattari has really good ideas to contribute about what's called rhizomal or horizontal revolution. An example of this that I would give would be the Arab Spring, right? When you looked at it from the West, most people thought that all of a sudden, these things just started happening, and it was miraculous and spontaneous. But the reality, and then they weren't connected, right? They were independent of each other. And the reality is, one that we don't talk about is that the movements that kicked off the Arab Spring have been brewing for decades, right? The Arab Spring was just that situationist moment when they could pop off. So Egypt didn't just happen. People have been working to make Egypt happen for a long time. But a rhizomal revolution comes with an understanding that, kind of like asparagus, the conditions, the common conditions of oppression under capitalism, oppression under neocolonialism, right, are everything that the people of Northern Africa and the Middle East were dealing with at the time is spreading like an undercurrent underground. And then, like asparagus, right, it pops up randomly at breakpoints. And so that's why it's called rhizomal revolution, because that rhizomes grow underground and then shoot up. So I think that's a really important idea for Greens to understand, right? Because we want to harness that. The common conditions are there. They manifest in unique ways locally, but the common conditions are there. So we need to understand how to, best activate them and best, see where our opportunities are. And then the last one I have on this is Hatred of Democracy by Jacques Rancière. This one, another very short book, and it lays out a blistering critique of liberalism, to the point that like you finish the book and you go, when you look living here in the United States, like living in Illinois, where to run for Congress as a Republican or a Democrat in my district, I have to collect 750 signatures, but to run as a Green, I have to collect 15,000. Right? The hatred, and this is a deep blue Democrat-ran state, right? The people who put that in place are the Democrats. So it's not really hard for me to imagine that the Democratic Party is fundamentally opposed to democracy. But that's because of kind of the realistic conditions I see on the ground. Ron Sierra's book takes it to like a fundamental theoretical level, that liberalism, neoliberalism, traditional liberalism, whatever, capitalist liberalism is fundamentally opposed to any kind of democracy, and that the Western democracies that are lauded in academia are actually a farce and anti-democratic to their core, which I think is a good thing for Greens and Socialists to kind of understand. Some history I thought I had added. I missed one, I guess. History ones I'm just speeding through because we're long. A People's History of the United States, pretty basic and obvious, right? Alternative History. Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz is a very good one. Subterranean Fire by Sharon Smith is a great great history of working class activism. I don't see it. Black Against Empire is a history and politics of the Black Panther Party. The History of the Russian Revolution by Trotsky gives a good understanding of that. October by China Melville is another good one that looks at the revolution, right? Because like I said, whether we agree with the project or not, there's a lot of value to be had, right? Even looking back at something like the history of the Russian Revolution over a century ago, in a completely different world with completely different material conditions, it can't be copied, but we can learn things from it. And then people like Parenti, is Against Empire, which was a very important book about empire. So like I said, going all the way back to that beginning one, right? There's always more, right? We could do every single one of these slides for hours. Didn't want to dive that deep into it, but wanted to give a little bit more of a breadth of things that we should talk about. So that's what we have. I do want to look. Gordon says BLM is crucial. Afro-Americans never get reconciliation. Their families have no inheritance, while those who profited them have perpetuated wealth in the capitalist system. I wanted to bring that. Absolutely agree. And I think that Gordon came in late, and I just want to say that we started with the civil rights movement and stuff. So we covered into that in our discussion. And then I also, before we left, as a good transition, International Green Party said, how can socialists bring about any type of tangible change? In the 60s, Dr. Martin Luther King won the right to vote, but that has been wiped away. What can Greens and Reds do? Show up next month for our organizing workshop, right? Today was talking about socialism, but we will be back next month. We will be back on December 27th. It's like always the fourth Tuesday. For our last 101 session of the year. It'll be Organizing 101. Like all the others, you can view our past ones at greensocialist.net/101s. So you can look at those old ones. In this upcoming organizing one, the previous one, we did how to build a local. Right, so we kind of envisioned that you want to start a Green Party local, or it could be any kind of independent socialist organization, but there wasn't one. And so what were some initial steps that you could take on the 27th next month for our fourth Organizing 101 session? It's going to be on a just as important issue in the Green Party, how to rebuild your local, right? Green Party locals were devastated by COVID. We've been devastated by anyone but Trump, right? So we kind of got hit by this double whammy of like the anyone but Trump, which from my opinion and people I've talked to, was worse than it was in 2004 with anyone but Bush. So that was already going to take a toll and hit us. But then add in COVID and the fact that we couldn't meet, we couldn't organize, we couldn't knock doors, we couldn't be involved in our community as easily. A lot of Green Party locals are kind of withered. And so our next Organizing 101 next month on the 27th will cover how to rebuild a local. You got anything, Garrett?
Nope. It sounds good. We'll see you next month, really.
Yep. And I did want to say too, if you want to get involved in working with us, right? Like we said, we could do a 2-hour presentation, workshop on readings from every one of these slides. The big barrier is Garrett and I's time and the other committee members' time, right? And our experience and our knowledge and our access. So if you want to get involved in our education working group, you can email me at chris@howiehawkins.us. You can also sign up at greensocialist.net. We've got a meeting on Sunday, and get involved that way. But if you want to just skip that whole kind of onboarding process and come straight to me, you can. We would love to put together reading lists on every one of these. We'd love to turn those reading lists into, video sessions. We've got a bunch of stuff that we're working on over time, and that we could pull off a lot easier with a few more hands on deck. So if you're interested in working on education stuff with us, give me an email and we'll get you plugged in. But we will see everybody back next month for our fourth session of Organizing 101. If you want to get into the organizing stuff before then, like we said, you can go to greensocialist.net/101s and see our original, our first 3 sessions, where we, do a pretty deep dive into, kind of organizing theory, with the caveat that there's very little resources for independent organizing. Most of it is oriented towards mainstream, political organizing or not-for-profit union organizing, which are, similar but different from what we're trying to do. So if you want to, dive in before we get together again next month for our next of these monthly sessions, you can go there and watch those videos or listen to them as podcasts or just look through the slide deck. And we will see everybody next month, and have a good Thanksgiving.